The silence was perfect until it wasn't. I had been sitting in our kitchen for 47 minutes, watching the steam rise from my untouched coffee, when my phone buzzed against the marble countertop. The sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the morning, like a stone dropped into a quiet pond. David had left for work 3 hours earlier, kissing my forehead with the same mechanical tenderness he'd practiced for the past 8 years. And I had settled into my usual routine of pretending productivity while anxiety gnawed at my insides like a patient animal. The notification was from Instagram. Someone had tagged me in a video. I almost didn't look. These days, social media felt like walking through a minefield of other people's happiness, engagement announcements, baby showers, career milestones that highlighted the growing emptiness in my own life. But something about the timing, the way the phone had buzzed just as I was thinking about David's increasingly frequent late nights at the office, made my finger hover over the screen. The video began to play automatically, and the world tilted. There was David, my David, down on one knee in what looked like Central Park. The woman standing before him had her hands pressed to her mouth in that universal gesture of delighted shock. She was younger than me, maybe 26 to my 34, with the kind of effortless beauty that made you aware of your own imperfections. Her hair caught the afternoon sunlight like spun gold, and when she said yes, I could see her lips forming the word even though I couldn't hear it over the blood rushing in my ears. Her face transformed with a joy so pure it was almost obscene. The caption read, "When your best friend gets the surprise of her life." So happy for Emma and David. Hashtag love wins, hashtag engaged, hashtag surprise proposal. I watched it 3 times before my brain could process what I was seeing. The video had already been viewed 47,000 times, shared hundreds of times, hearted by thousands of strangers who thought they were witnessing a beautiful moment instead of the destruction of someone else's life. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the comments. Friends of Emma, her name was Emma, expressing their excitement, their disbelief, their absolute certainty that this was meant to be. Someone had written, "You two are going to be so happy together." Another comment, "Finally, we've all been waiting for this. We've all been waiting for this." The implication hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a new relationship. This wasn't a sudden romance. This was something that had been building, something that people had been watching and rooting for, something that had a history and a community and a future that didn't include me. I set the phone down with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb. The kitchen around me looked exactly the same white cabinets David and I had chosen together, the same subway tile backsplash we'd installed ourselves during a weekend that had felt like playing house. The same coffee maker that David had surprised me with for my birthday last year, saying he wanted to make sure I had everything I needed to start each day perfectly. But everything was different now, the way a room looks different when you learn someone has died in it. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through law school, through the bar exam, through the slow disintegration of my career when the panic attacks started, tried to find alternative explanations. Maybe this was a joke. Maybe it was a commercial. Maybe David had a twin brother I didn't know about. But the desperate creativity of denial only lasted a few seconds before reality reasserted itself with crushing certainty. David wasn't at work. David was in love with someone else. David had proposed to someone else. And judging by the comments, David had been building a life with someone else for months, maybe years, while I had been sitting in our kitchen, drinking cold coffee and wondering why I felt like I was disappearing. I walked to the bathroom and vomited with the quiet efficiency of someone who had had a lot of practice lately. When I looked at myself in the mirror afterward, I was surprised by how normal I appeared. I had expected to see the devastation written across my face, to look like someone whose life had just been turned inside out. Instead, I looked like I always did these days, tired, vaguely anxious, forgettable. The kind of woman who could be replaced without anyone really noticing the difference. The thought should have been devastating, but instead it felt almost like relief. For months, I had been telling myself that I was imagining things. The way David's phone was always face down when he was home. The way he had started working out again, buying new clothes, paying attention to grooming details that hadn't mattered to him in years. The way he looked at me sometimes, with a kind of gentle pity that made me feel like a burden he was too kind to abandon. I had told myself I was being paranoid, that the anxiety was making me see threats where none existed. I had gone to therapy, taken medication, practiced breathing exercises, done everything I could to convince myself that the growing distance between us was in my head. But it wasn't in my head. It was real, and it had been real for a long time, and now I had 47,000 witnesses to prove it. The house felt different when I walked back to the kitchen. It felt like a stage set, like props arranged to convince an audience of something that wasn't true. The photos on the refrigerator, David and me at my sister's wedding, on vacation in Charleston, at his company Christmas party, looked like evidence of a crime. The bills on the counter, both our names printed in neat black letters, seemed like forgeries. Even the coffee maker, still brewing the second cup David would never drink, sounded like it was mocking me. I sat back down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. If David had been living a double life, there would be evidence. There always was. People who thought they were being careful usually weren't, not really. They just got better at hiding things from the people who didn't want to look too closely. His email was easy. We had shared passwords for everything. An intimacy that had once felt romantic and now felt like another lie. The account was mostly work-related correspondence, nothing obviously incriminating, but there were gaps. Emails deleted in batches, entire conversations missing. It was the digital equivalent of a room that had been cleaned too thoroughly, where the absence of mess was itself suspicious. His credit card statements were more illuminating. Restaurants I'd never been to, on dates when he'd told me he was working late. A jewelry store purchase from 3 weeks ago for $3,847. Hotel charges in the city on days when he'd said he was at conferences. Netflix subscriptions to 2 different accounts. A gym membership at a place across town from his office, nowhere near our house. Each discovery felt like pulling a thread, watching the fabric of our life together unravel one strand at a time. But underneath the devastation was something unexpected, a growing sense of clarity that I hadn't felt in months. The world was snapping back into focus, puzzle pieces arranging themselves into a picture that finally made sense. I called in sick to work, something I'd been doing more and more frequently lately. My boss, Jennifer, was understanding in that carefully professional way that suggested she was keeping notes for a performance review that wouldn't go well. But I couldn't bring myself to care about that now. My entire career had been built on attention to detail, on the ability to see patterns and inconsistencies that others missed. It seemed fitting that I would use those same skills to deconstruct my own life. The afternoon passed in a strange haze of discovery and numbness. I found Emma's Instagram account, unlocked and public in the way of someone who had never had reason to hide. Her photos told the story my husband had been keeping from me. Dinners at restaurants I recognized from his credit card statements, weekend trips that coincided with his supposed work conferences, selfies taken in what I now realized was our gym, the one he'd been going to for months without mentioning it to me. She was a physical therapist, worked at a clinic in the city. She had a dog named Buster and a weakness for artisanal donuts and yoga classes. She volunteered at a literacy program and posted inspirational quotes about following your dreams and believing in love. She looked happy in every single photo, the kind of effortless happiness that comes from being young and certain that the world will give you what you want. In one photo, taken 2 months ago, she was wearing a sweater I recognized. It was one of David's favorites, a navy cashmere pullover I had given him for Christmas 2 years ago. In the photo, it was draped over her shoulders while she sat on what looked like a hotel balcony, city lights twinkling behind her. The caption read, "Sometimes the universe just knows what you need." #grateful #love wins. The hashtag was the same one used in the proposal video. Apparently, love winning was a theme in Emma's life. I closed the laptop and sat in the growing darkness of the kitchen, not bothering to turn on the lights. Outside, I could hear the sounds of normal life continuing. Cars passing, neighbors coming home from work, a dog barking somewhere down the street. The mundane symphony of a world that hadn't stopped turning just because mine had ended. When David's key turned in the lock at 7:23 p.m., I was still sitting at the kitchen table. I heard him pause in the entryway, probably surprised by the darkness, by the unusual stillness of the house. Usually, I would be cooking dinner or watching television or moving around in some way that announced my presence, that made the house feel occupied and welcoming. Tonight, I sat perfectly still and waited. "Mel?" His voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to gauge a situation. "You okay?" "The house is dark." I heard him set down his briefcase, the sound echoing in the silence. Then his footsteps, hesitant now, moving toward the kitchen. When he appeared in the doorway, I could see him outlined against the light from the hallway. He looked the same as he had this morning, but somehow different too. Maybe it was knowing that he had spent the day celebrating his engagement to another woman. Maybe it was understanding that every time he had looked at me recently, He had been calculating how much longer he would have to pretend. Mel? What's wrong? Why are you sitting in the dark? I reached for my phone and played the video. The sound of Emma's delighted squeal filled the kitchen, followed by the ambient noise of other people in the park celebrating with them. I watched David's face in the glow of the screen, watched him understand that his two worlds had finally collided. He didn't try to deny it. I had to give him credit for that. He didn't insult my intelligence with explanations or excuses or claims that it wasn't what it looked like. He just stood there, his shoulders sagging slightly, and let the truth settle between us like debris after an explosion. How long? I asked, and my voice sounded remarkably steady. A year. He paused. A little more than a year. The conferences? Most of them weren't real. The gym membership? She works out there. I nodded, adding another piece to the puzzle. It was almost satisfying, in a perverse way, to have my suspicions confirmed so thoroughly. Are you going to say anything? I asked when the silence stretched too long. David moved closer, pulled out the chair across from me, sat down like someone approaching an injured animal. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but I'm sorry. For which part? For lying to me for a year, or for letting me find out on social media? He flinched. I was going to tell you. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. When? After the wedding? Mel. I'm curious about the logistics. Were you planning to move out gradually, or just disappear one day? Were you going to tell me you were leaving me for someone else, or were you going to let me think it was my fault? It's not your fault. The words hung in the air between us, and I realized that I had been waiting to hear them, even though they didn't help. Even though fault and responsibility were complicated things that couldn't be untangled with a simple disclaimer. But it's not my fault either, I said. Is it? David looked down at his hands. You've been struggling. With the anxiety, with work, with everything. I didn't know how to help you anymore. There it was. The truth that had been living underneath all the lies, the real reason that was somehow more devastating than infidelity. I hadn't just been replaced. I had been found wanting. I had been weighed and measured and determined to be insufficient. So you found someone who wasn't struggling. It wasn't like that. What was it like? He was quiet for a long time, and I could see him trying to find words that wouldn't be cruel, wouldn't be too honest. But we were past the point of protective lies now. It was easy, he said finally. Being with her was easy. The simplicity of it was breathtaking. Not passionate, not destined, not love at first sight. Just easy. I thought about Emma's Instagram photos, all that effortless happiness, all that certainty that the universe would provide. I thought about how uncomplicated it must be to love someone like that. Someone who didn't wake up in the middle of the night convinced that everything was falling apart. Someone who didn't need to be reassured and managed and carefully handled. I should go, David said. I can get a hotel tonight, and we can figure out the rest tomorrow. Where's your ring? The question seemed to surprise him. What? Your wedding ring. You're not wearing it. He looked down at his hand as if he hadn't noticed. I took it off this afternoon. After you proposed to someone else while wearing it? Mel. Just answer the question. Did you propose to her while you were still wearing your wedding ring? Yes. I nodded. Another piece of information that wouldn't matter in the long run, but somehow felt important to know. The full scope of the betrayal, documented and cataloged like evidence in a case I would never prosecute. David left that night, taking only a small suitcase and promising to call me tomorrow. I watched him drive away from the living room window, standing behind the curtains like someone afraid to be seen. When his taillights disappeared around the corner, I was surprised by how quiet the house became. I had expected to feel something dramatic, rage or grief or relief, but instead I felt hollow, like someone had reached inside me and scooped out everything important. I spent the next 3 days in a state of suspended animation, moving through the house like a ghost haunting my own life. David texted several times, asking how I was, suggesting we meet to talk about practical things like the mortgage and the joint accounts and the wedding photos that were still displayed throughout the house. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready for practical things. I was still trying to understand how thoroughly I had misunderstood my own life. On the 4th day, my sister Kate called. She had seen the video. Apparently, it had made its way to Facebook, where older relatives and family friends had started sharing it with comments like, "Isn't this David? And wait, isn't he married to Mel?" Kate's voice was carefully controlled, the way it got when she was furious but trying to be supportive. "I'm coming over," she said. "You don't need to do that. I'm already in the car." Kate arrived with Chinese takeout and wine and the kind of grim determination that suggested she was prepared to stage an intervention. She took one look at me, still in the same clothes I'd been wearing since David left, my hair unwashed, the house dark and still, and set the food on the counter with more force than necessary. "Okay," she said. "Talk." So I did. I told her about the video, about the credit card statements, about the year of lies that had been hiding in plain sight. I told her about the anxiety, about the way I had been disappearing from my own life even before David left. I told her about the relief I felt underneath the devastation, the way it almost felt like freedom to finally know the truth. Kate listened without interrupting, her face cycling through expressions of anger and sympathy and something that looked like recognition. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I knew something was wrong," she said finally. "At Christmas, you seemed so distant. Like you were watching your own life from the outside. I was, but I thought it was just the anxiety. I thought you were going through a rough patch. Maybe I was. Maybe the anxiety was just a symptom of something bigger." Kate opened the wine and poured 2 glasses, sliding one across the counter to me. "What are you going to do?" It was the question I had been avoiding, the one that required me to think beyond the immediate crisis and into an uncertain future. For the past 4 days, I had been existing in the space between one life and the next, suspended in a kind of limbo where nothing was decided and anything was possible. "I don't know," I said. "I don't know who I am without David. I don't know who I was with him, either, apparently. You're my sister. You're a lawyer. You're the person who always remembers everyone's birthday and makes the best chocolate chip cookies and cries during dog commercials. You're still all of those things. Those feel like small things right now. They're not small. They're who you are when no one is watching, when you're not trying to be anyone else's version of yourself." I sipped the wine and considered this. For the past year, maybe longer, I had been trying so hard to be the version of myself that David needed. The wife who wasn't anxious, who didn't need too much reassurance, who made their life together easy and uncomplicated. But that version of me had been exhausting to maintain and ultimately impossible to sustain. "What if I don't know how to be alone?" I asked. "Then you'll learn. People do." Kate stayed until late, helping me begin the process of untangling a shared life. We made lists of accounts to separate, belongings to divide, conversations that would need to happen. The practical aspects of ending a marriage turned out to be surprisingly mundane. Phone calls to credit card companies, decisions about furniture, the logistics of one person moving out of a shared space. But underneath the practicalities was something more fundamental. The work of figuring out who I was when I wasn't half of a couple, when I wasn't trying to be easy or uncomplicated or anything other than myself. The divorce proceedings moved with the kind of efficiency that suggested David was eager to finalize things. He was apologetic but distant, treating our interactions with the careful politeness of strangers. Through mutual friends, I learned that he and Emma had moved in together, that they were planning a wedding for the following spring, that they seemed genuinely happy in the way that people are when they've found exactly what they were looking for. I tried not to think about them too much, but sometimes I would catch myself wondering what their conversations were like, whether they talked about me, whether David had told Emma about the anxiety that had made me so difficult to love. I wondered if Emma knew she was the easier choice, the path of least resistance, the woman who had won by being everything I couldn't manage to be. But mostly I tried to focus on rebuilding. I found a new therapist, one who specialized in life transitions and helped me understand that the end of my marriage wasn't just about David's betrayal. It was about my own complicity in disappearing from my own life. I started taking walks in the morning, something I had never done when David lived with me because I had been too busy trying to be available for whatever he might need. I redecorated the house, not with the careful compromises that had characterized our shared aesthetic, but with things I actually liked: bright colors, interesting textures, art that spoke to me even if it wouldn't appeal to anyone else. I went back to work with a focus I hadn't felt in months. The clarity that had come with understanding the truth about my marriage extended to other areas of my life, and I found myself taking on cases with renewed energy, remembering why I had chosen law in the first place. My boss, Jennifer, commented on the change, saying I seemed more present, more engaged than I had been in a long time. I told her. I think I forgot how to be present for a while. 6 months after David left, I ran into Emma at the grocery store. I recognized her immediately, even though she looked different from her Instagram photos, more ordinary, more human. She was in the produce section, examining avocados with the same careful attention I had been giving to the apples in my cart. For a moment, I considered turning around, avoiding the encounter altogether. But something made me stay, maybe curiosity, maybe a need to see her up close, to understand what David had chosen instead of me. She looked up and saw me, and I watched recognition dawn on her face. She didn't look guilty or defensive, just surprised and slightly uncomfortable, the way anyone would be when confronted with an awkward situation. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi." We stood there for a moment, two women in a grocery store, connected by nothing more than a shared history with the same man. She was prettier in person than in her photos, but also younger, more fragile somehow. I found myself wondering if she knew about the credit card statements, the elaborate lies, the year of deception that had made their relationship possible. "I want you to know," she said. "I didn't know he was married when we first met. Not for a long time." I believed her. She had the earnest sincerity of someone who had convinced herself that the story she was telling was true, even if the details were more complicated than she wanted to acknowledge. "When did you find out?" I asked. "A few months in. He told me he was separated, that you were getting divorced." Another lie, another revision of the truth to make the story easier to live with. I wondered if David had convinced himself that this version was true, that our marriage had been over long before he left, that the papers and the legal proceedings were just formalities. "I'm sorry," Emma said. "I know that doesn't mean much, but I am sorry." I looked at her, this young woman who had unknowingly participated in the destruction of my marriage, who was now planning a wedding to a man who had proven himself capable of elaborate deception, and felt something unexpected: pity. "Be careful," I said, and then I walked away, leaving her standing among the avocados with a confused expression on her face. That night, I called Kate and told her about the encounter. "What did you mean when you told her to be careful?" Kate asked. "I meant that if someone is willing to lie to his wife for a year, he's probably willing to lie to anyone." "Do you think he's lying to her?" "I think he's lying to himself. And eventually, that becomes everyone's problem." I meant it, but I also recognized the truth underneath the warning. I was better off without David, without the version of myself I had been trying to be for him. The woman who had sat in the dark kitchen 6 months ago, discovering her husband's betrayal through social media, had been disappearing long before the video went viral. The betrayal had just made the disappearance visible. 2 years later, I was having coffee with a friend when she showed me another video on her phone. David and Emma were getting divorced. The footage was from a local news station. Apparently, their split had gotten messy enough to make the papers. Something about financial discrepancies and a pattern of deception that had finally caught up with him. "Didn't you used to be married to him?" my friend asked, scrolling through the news article. "A long time ago," I said, which was true even though it had only been 2 years. That version of my life felt like something that had happened to someone else, a story I remembered but no longer lived. I watched the video without sound, studying David's face as he left what looked like a lawyer's office. He appeared older, more tired than I remembered. Emma wasn't in the footage, but the article mentioned that she had filed the divorce papers, citing irreconcilable differences and financial impropriety. I felt something that might have been satisfaction, but it was muted, distant. The woman I had been 2 years ago would have wanted justice, would have felt vindicated by the confirmation that David's pattern of deception extended beyond our marriage. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was someone who had learned to exist independently, who had rebuilt her life from the foundation up, who understood that the best revenge was simply living well. I handed the phone back to my friend and finished my coffee. Outside, it was the kind of crisp autumn day that made everything feel possible, the kind of weather that reminded you that endings were also beginnings, that sometimes the most devastating thing that could happen to you was also the most necessary. I walked home to my house, mine now, fully and completely, where no one was waiting to tell me lies or ask me to be smaller than I was. I walked home to a life that was complicated and sometimes lonely but entirely authentic, entirely mine. I walked home to the silence that had once been broken by a buzzing phone and a viral video, the silence that had taught me the difference between being alone and being abandoned. The silence was perfect, and this time, I let it stay that way.